He walked through the gates of Ost-in-Edil in broad daylight. Beautiful, articulate, smiling. He said his name was Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. He said he came from the Valar. He said he had come to help. He stayed for 400 years. Gil-galad refused to meet him. Galadriel did not trust him. Only one elf in all of Middle-earth opened his workshop door, the greatest smith of his age, the grandson of Fëanor himself. And in the end, it took just a single sentence, spoken aloud in a distant forge, to bring the whole long lie crashing down. How do you deceive the wisest people in Middle-earth for 4 centuries? Not in a single night of black sorcery, not by force. You walk into their gates in broad daylight, beautiful, articulate, generous. You say your name is Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. You say you come from the Valar themselves, sent to help. You stay for roughly 400 years. And when you finally leave, the smiths of Eregion possess ringcraft no elf has ever held. Celebrimbor, grandson of Fëanor, has forged 19 rings of power, 9 for mortal men, 7 for the dwarf lords, and 3, alone and in secret, for the elves. Somewhere east, in a mountain of fire, the teacher is forging a ring of his own. This is the story Tolkien returned to again and again, in the Silmarillion, in unfinished tales, in the late essays gathered as The Nature of Middle-earth, in private letters written across decades. He kept returning to it because something about it would not let him alone. Other Dark Lord stories in his legendarium are stories of overpowering. Morgoth grinding Beleriand to ruin, the Witch King breaking the gates of Minas Tirith. The Annatar episode is the only one that is a story of seduction. Not an elf overcome by an enemy, an elf who opened the gates himself. 3 of the wisest Eldar in Middle-earth saw something wrong with the radiant stranger. Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, refused to admit him to Lindon. Galadriel did not trust him and would not have him in her land. Elrond was wary, and yet none of them stopped what followed, because none of them ran the workshop. Only Celebrimbor, the smith hungering to surpass the works of his grandfather, the Fëanorian who had spent his life renouncing Fëanor, let him in. The result was the catastrophe of the Second Age, the forging of the One Ring, the sack of Eregion, the founding of Imladris by survivors fleeing south. Celebrimbor's body shot full of orc arrows and raised on a pole as a battle standard. What follows is the anatomy of that lie, how it was built, why it worked, why 3 filters of elven society caught it and 1 did not, and how 4 centuries of patient masquerade ended in a single instant of cosmic perception, when a voice in a distant forge spoke 7 lines in a tongue no elf had ever heard, and every ring-bearer in Eregion knew, all at once, in the same heartbeat, that they had been betrayed. To understand why the elves listened to Annatar, you have to understand what he actually was. Sauron, in his origin, was a Maia of Aulë, the same Valar whose people the Noldor most resemble. Aulë is the smith of the powers, the maker of mountains, the Valar who shaped the lamps of Iluin and Ormal, the master under whom the elves of Valinor learned their crafts. When Tolkien wrote, in one of his letters, that Sauron was not evil in origin, he meant it literally. The being who would one day forge the One Ring began as an apprentice to a god of making, in the same workshop the Noldor themselves had studied in. This matters because it means Annatar's lessons were not a trick of stagecraft. The law was real. The skill was real. The hands that taught the smiths of Ost in Edhil knew exactly what they were doing, because those hands had been doing it since before Ada was finished. In Unfinished Tales, Tolkien names the alternative identities Sauron wore in Eregion alongside Annatar. Aulendil, friend of Aulë, Artano, High Smith. These are not ornaments. They are direct identity claims. Annatar is telling the Noldor, in their own languages, exactly which workshop he was trained in. And the Noldor would have recognized the credentials. They had spent the years of the trees as students of Aulë. Their finest craftsman, Fëanor, was Aulë's most brilliant pupil. To the smiths of Ost in Edhil, an emissary who arrived speaking their craft language, knowing their methods, offering to teach them the next step. This was not a stranger asking for trust. This was the kind of being the elves were predisposed to welcome. He looked like help arriving from the place they expected help to come from. The mask was not a lie about who Annatar resembled. He really did resemble what he claimed. The lie was only about what he wanted. That is the structural genius of the disguise, and it is also the reason it took 4 centuries to unravel. There was no false note for the elves to catch. The teacher's accent was correct. The teacher's lore was correct. The teacher's methods produced finer work than the smiths had ever made before. When Tolkien wrote, in letter 131, he was still fair in that early time, and his motives and those of the elves seemed to go partly together. That partly is doing enormous work. It was not a counterfeit overlap. It was a real overlap, with a hidden divergence at the end of it. Annatar did not walk into one elven realm and conquer it. He walked into 3, and was rejected by 2 before he ever reached the forge. The first refusal came from Lindon. Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, would not permit Annatar to enter his realm at all. The Silmarillion gives no record of any conversation, no theological debate, no probing question, no moment where the High King looked into the stranger's eyes and saw something hidden. Just the institutional answer, no. That silence is itself worth studying. Gil-galad's reason was not insight, it was caution. He was the High King of an exiled people at the western edge of the world, his realm pressed against the sea, his court a generation older than any other in Middle-earth. He had nothing to gain from an unknown emissary, and a great deal to lose from being wrong. So he said no, without explaining. Institutional power says no by default to strangers who arrive bearing gifts. The second refusal came from Galadriel, who at this time was ruling Eregion with Celebrimbor. She was older than Gil-galad. She had seen Fëanor's fall and the kinslaying at Alqualonde. She had crossed the Helcaraxe on foot. When Annatar arrived, she did not trust him. Unfinished Tales is direct. She would not have him in the land. She gives no theological argument either. She does not explain herself. She simply will not have him in her presence. This is intuition refusing, where institution refused on principle. Galadriel saw something. She could not, or did not, name what she saw. But she would not let it stand near her. And then the third filter, in the same city, in the same year. The smiths of the Gwaith I Mírdain, the brotherhood Celebrimbor led, opened their workshop to Annatar gladly. Unfinished Tales again. The Mírdain listened to him, for he had great knowledge of such matters. They listened because they had a use for him, because his arrival was not a question to be evaluated, it was an offer to be accepted. 3 filters, 2 refusals, 1 acceptance, and only the third had the forge. This is the structural lesson of the Annatar episode, and Tolkien states it nowhere directly because he did not need to. The geometry is enough. Institutional caution rejects on principle. Personal intuition rejects on instinct. But individual ambition, when it has a project that needs something, will reach past both principle and instinct to take what it needs. The deception did not require fooling all the elves. It required fooling one workshop. The other refusals could be true and clear-eyed and entirely accurate. They did not matter, because the smithy door was open. Why did the offer work at all? The temptation, in answering this, is to credit Sauron's cunning, to imagine that Annatar's lie was so brilliant it could have seduced anyone. That reading flatters the deceiver and lets the deceived off too easily. Tolkien's own diagnosis is harsher. The offer worked because the elves already wanted exactly what Annatar was selling. He did not implant a new desire, he handed them a tool for an old one. In Letter 131, Tolkien describes the elves of Middle-earth with a word so blunt it has become controversial among readers. He calls them embalmers. Not in a small or metaphorical sense. He means it as a sustained spiritual diagnosis. The elves, he writes, loved Middle-earth. They did not want to leave it. But they also could not bear to watch it change. They wanted to hold their corner of the world in a kind of stasis, to make it Valinor without crossing the sea to reach Valinor, to stop the clock inside the leaves and keep them green. In the same letter, Tolkien explains what the Rings of Power actually did at the deepest level. The chief power of all the rings alike was the prevention or slowing of decay, the preservation of what is desired or loved, or its semblance. That is what the rings were for, not power in a martial sense, not domination, the arresting of time itself. Now look at the offer Annatar brought, and consider how exactly it fit. He came saying, Middle-earth need not fade. The desolate lands need not stay desolate. The elves who love this country could make it as fair as Erisea, as fair as Valinor, without having to leave. The Silmarillion preserves his recorded speech almost word for word. But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Erisea, nay, even as Valinor? That sentence is the entire trap. And the trap works because the elves had already wanted, for 2 ages, what Annatar was promising. The teacher did not need to corrupt them. He only needed to offer them the means to be what they already wished to be. This is the harder and more uncomfortable layer of the deception. The lie was not that the rings would preserve Middle-earth. The rings genuinely did preserve Middle-earth. Lothlorien stayed unchanging for 3,000 years. Imladris remained a memory of the elder days deep into the Third Age. The grey havens held their twilight beauty until the last ship sailed. Annatar's promise was kept. What he concealed was the price of keeping it, the binding, the dependency, the single forge in Orodruin into which all of those preserved beauties were quietly hostage. In Letter 131, Tolkien says it as plainly as he ever says anything. This frightful evil can and does arise from an apparently good root, the desire to benefit the world and others, speedily and according to the benefactor's own plans. Speedily. The word does enormous work. The elves wanted to fix Middle-earth, and they wanted to fix it now, on their own terms, by their own hands. Annatar offered the shortcut. The horror of the rings was not that they failed, it was that they worked. The elvish hunger explains why the rings were attractive in general. It does not explain why Celebrimbor specifically took the workshop door off its hinges to let the stranger in. For that, Tolkien gives a single phrase, in a late essay published in The Nature of Middle-earth. He writes that Sauron was more successful with the Noldor of Eregion, especially with Celebrimbor, secretly anxious to rival the skill and fame of Fëanor. The word choice matters. Tolkien does not call Celebrimbor proud. He does not call him vain or greedy or power-hungry. The word is anxious, and the word before it is secretly. Celebrimbor did not admit this even to himself. To understand why that matters, consider who Celebrimbor was. He was the only known grandchild of Fëanor, the brilliant, ruinous, doom-bringing smith whose 3 Silmarils had set the entire First Age on fire. Celebrimbor's father was Curufin, the most like Fëanor of all the 7 sons, the most dangerous, the most treacherous. In Nargothrond, when Curufin and Celegorm betrayed Finrod Felagund and tried to seize the throne, Celebrimbor refused to go with them. He renounced his father in front of his uncle's court and stayed behind when the brothers were driven out. Tolkien writes that Celebrimbor was an elf of wholly different temper from Curufin. The renunciation was real. Celebrimbor spent the rest of the First Age outside the Fëanorian disasters. He did not fight at Doriath. He did not fight at the Havens. He did not take part in the kinslayings that consumed his uncles one by one. When the First Age ended, he was one of the very few descendants of Fëanor's line still alive, and he had earned that survival by being everything his family was not. And then he came east, to Eregion, and built a brotherhood of smiths, worked with dwarves, something no Fëanorian would ever have done. The doors of Durin, the western gate of Khazad-dûm, were made by Celebrimbor and the dwarf smith Narvi together, and their inscription names them both as equals. I, Narvi, made them. Celebrimbor of Hollin drew these signs. That collaboration is unique in the Legendarium. It is the exact opposite of Fëanor, who hoarded his Silmarils and would not even share their light with the Valar, who had asked him to surrender them to heal the world. And yet, secretly anxious to rival the skill and fame of Fëanor. The renunciation was real, and the rivalry was real, at the same time, in the same elf. Celebrimbor had built his life on not being his grandfather, but the project of his life, the great work of his hands, was, in form, the same kind of project Fëanor had attempted. Capturing and preserving light, life, beauty in a wrought object. Fëanor made 3 jewels that held the light of the 2 trees. Celebrimbor would make 19 rings that held something more elusive, the slowing of time itself. The medium changed, the impulse did not. Sauron saw what Celebrimbor would not see in himself. That phrase from the nature of Middle-earth is precise. He dissembles his wrath and gets round Celebrimbor. Annatar did not flatter Celebrimbor's vanity, because Celebrimbor did not have vanity to flatter. He flattered the project. He came offering exactly the knowledge that would let Celebrimbor's hands do what Celebrimbor's heart had quietly always wanted them to do. Exceed the work of his grandfather in the very arena where his grandfather had been supreme. The smith who had spent 4 ages renouncing his line was offered the tools to surpass it. He did not refuse. There is a sentence in the nature of Middle-earth that ought to change how readers think about Sauron in this period. It is unobtrusive, and Tolkien did not develop it. But it says more about the kind of intelligence operating behind the Annatar mask than any other line in the corpus. He sees that he has met his match, or at least a very serious adversary, in Galadriel. He dissembles his wrath and gets round Celebrimbor. Pause on the verbs: sees, dissembles, gets round. This is not a dark lord meeting a hero. This is an operator identifying an obstacle, choosing not to confront it, and routing the project to a different node of the network. The instinct is not military, it is bureaucratic. It is, almost unsettlingly, modern. Sauron, who could, in a later age, command armies of tens of thousands and break the walls of Minas Tirith with a hammer the size of a small tree, looks at Galadriel and decides that the cost of opposing her directly is too high. So he goes around her. He never raises his voice. He never reveals his strength. He spends decades, perhaps a century, working privately on Celebrimbor and the smiths of Eregion, building influence inside Galadriel's own realm while she watches. Unfinished Tales preserves a variant of the story, one Tolkien did not finalize, but which Christopher Tolkien published because the underlying mechanic is consistent with the late writings. In this variant, somewhere between the years 1350 and 1400 of the Second Age, the Mírdain rebel against Galadriel and Celebrimbor. Encouraged by Annatar working in the shadows, the Smiths assert their own authority over Eregion. Galadriel leaves the realm of her own accord, travelling east through Khazad-dûm with her daughter Celebrimbor into Lorinand, the land that would later become Lothlorien. Celebrimbor stays behind in Eregion, but Tolkien notes that he is ignored by Celebrimbor. The political centre has shifted. The Smiths run the realm now. The stranger they trusted runs the Smiths. Notice what has not happened. There has been no battle, no assassination, no dramatic confrontation. Galadriel has not been overpowered. She has simply been outmaneuvered by an enemy patient enough to let her leave on her own. This is what makes Sauron of the Second Age a different and more terrifying figure than Morgoth ever was. Morgoth was a hammer. He broke whatever stood in his path. If Morgoth had walked into Eregion, he would have tried to crush Galadriel directly, and she would have stood and fought, and the world would have known there was a war on. Sauron, in his Annatar phase, has learned a different lesson from his master's long defeat. Direct confrontation forfeits the disguise. The disguise is the weapon. So, if the disguise must be preserved, the obstacle must be removed without ever being touched. He removes Galadriel without touching her. He removes Gil-galad's influence over Eregion by simply not going to Lindon. He renders Elrond's wariness irrelevant by working out of a city Elrond does not yet sit in. He concentrates on the one node that has both the skill he needs and the receptivity he wants, and he spends 400 years there. When at last he leaves for Orodruin to forge the One, the work in Eregion is finished. The Smiths have made the rings. Celebrimbor has been instructed in every technique the One Ring will need to overmaster. Galadriel is gone, displaced, watching from a forest far to the east. There has not been a single sword drawn in Eregion in all that time. That is the 400-year con. Patience as a weapon, recognition of resistance, refusal to engage it, redirection of the project until the resistance no longer matters. Tolkien published it almost as a throwaway sentence in a late essay. It is, in fact, the single most chilling portrait of Sauron in the entire legendarium. And then, in a single instant, all of it broke. The Silmarillion describes the moment with extraordinary economy. Sauron forged the One Ring in the Mountain of Fire, and when he put it on his finger and uttered aloud its inscription, then Celebrimbor was aware of him, and from afar he knew his mind, even though he himself remained unseen. Read what just happened. Sauron, more than 1,000 miles east of Eregion, in a chamber inside Orodruin, finishes the Master Ring. He places it on his finger, and he speaks. He speaks lines no elf has ever heard, in a tongue invented to hold this exact intention. Ash nazg durbatuluk, ash nazg gimbatul, ash nazg thrakatuluk, ag burzum ishi krimpatul. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. The black speech of Mordor enters the legendarium here, at this moment, for the first time. Its first acoustic existence in the world is the spoken signature of a betrayal completed. And Celebrimbor heard him. Not as sound. There was no acoustic wave that crossed 1,000 miles of mountain and waste. The bond that Sauron had spent 4 centuries building through the rings was, in that instant, the channel by which his treachery broadcast itself. The same instrument that was supposed to give him dominion over the Elven-Smiths gave them, all at once, the awful clarity of seeing his mind from inside. Every ring-bearer in Eregion took their ring off in the same moment. The deception that had lasted 400 years collapsed in a single shared heartbeat of perception. The fair stranger they had welcomed, the Lord of Gifts, the friend of Aulë, the High Smith, was Sauron, was the lieutenant of Morgoth, was the architect of the cage they had spent their lives helping him build. War came almost immediately. Sauron demanded the rings. Celebrimbor refused. In what time remained to him, the smith made his last great act of foresight. He sent Vilya and Narya, two of the 3 rings he had made alone and in secret, north to Gil-galad. He gave Nenya, the 3rd, to Galadriel, who was waiting in her forest in the east. Then he made his stand. In the year 1697 of the Second Age, Sauron's army crossed into Eregion and sacked Ost in Edhil. Celebrimbor met him on the steps of the house of the Mírdain, the great guild hall of the jewelsmiths, and withstood Sauron on the steps of the great door. He was captured. He was tortured for the locations of the other rings. He gave up the 7 and the 9. He never gave up the 3. When there was nothing more to take from him, Sauron killed him, and then did something the chronicles record without rhetorical flourish, because the act itself needs none. He took Celebrimbor's body, shot through with orc arrows, and hoisted it on a pole. He carried it before his army as a banner. Hold that image for a moment. The smith who had made the doors of Durin, those tall silver doors whose names of welcome shone with starlight, is finished as a thing of horror, his body weaponized against the people who loved him. The maker reduced to a made object. The teacher of beauty turned into a teaching of contempt by the student who had pretended to learn from him. This is the lesson the Annatar mask had always concealed. The guest they had welcomed had not just been hiding evil, he had been hiding this specific aesthetic of contempt for the maker, for the kind of being who made beautiful things and trusted other beings to share that making. The banner was Sauron's final answer to the openness that had let him in. And the catastrophe did not end with Eregion. The 19 rings Celebrimbor made under Annatar's tutelage went out into the world and shaped everything that came after. The 9, given to mortal kings, became the Nazgûl, the 9 wraiths who would hunt a hobbit across Eriador 3,000 years later. The 7, given to the dwarf lords, kindled in them a hunger for gold that consumed them and their kingdoms. The 3, kept secret, sustained Imladris and Lothlorien and the wisdom of the Grey Havens for the rest of the elder days. But they were bound to the 1, even though Sauron had never touched them, because the craft method Annatar had taught was the same. When the 1 fell, the 3 would fail. Galadriel knew this. At the very end of the Third Age, when Frodo offered her the 1 ring in Lothlorien and she refused it, she also pronounced the price of the refusal. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel. That diminishment was Annatar's gift, completing itself 3,000 years late. The forest she had preserved with Nenya would lose its preservation. Lothlorien would fade. Rivendell would empty. The Grey Havens would launch their last ship. Every fading at the end of The Lord of the Rings, every elf who passes over sea, every light that goes out of Middle-earth, every page of the Red Book that closes on a quieter world, descends from the 4 centuries Celebrimbor spent in a workshop with a stranger who said his name was the Lord of Gifts. The deception was kept for 400 years. The consequences were paid for 3,000 more. The terrible thing about Annatar was not that he was a liar. It was that almost everything he said was true. The skills were real, the friendship was real. The work that came out of that workshop was real and beautiful and lasted 3,000 years. The lie was only at the end of it, and by the time anyone heard it spoken aloud, the rings were already made and the world was already changed. If this look into the long con of the Second Age drew you in, hit subscribe and join the channel for more journeys into the deep history of Middle-earth. And tell me in the comments, Do you think Celebrimbor ever truly suspected? Or did the truth break on him only in that final instant? Walk softly with strangers, bearing gifts.